I think we're maybe going to jump around a little bit, but I wanted to start with the press conference that you gave when you announced that you were retiring from politics.
Okay.
I had Brad Wall on my own podcast. This was a couple years ago now. And I asked him about something specifically that you said. It was the last answer that you gave. And you were talking about how politics is not a happy job. Politics isn't a happy job. It's not a fun job. And the reason why I think I thought about it so much is because it was, I think, a very honest answer from you. But the reason why I want to ask you about that, specifically about that for this podcast, is how are you able to go through not just being premier, but your entire political career? How are you able to go through that and not enjoy it or find that work happy? Because in my opinion, if I'm not happy, if I'm not enjoying the work that I'm doing, chances are my mental health is not going to be so great. And I know that you said that politics, it's a fulfilling job. So can you square those kind of two ends for us?
I think part of it's a question of definition, because the point I was trying to make was based on my belief that being happy, feeling comfortable, feeling safe, and, is not really an end in life. Like, I don't really think that that's super important. I think what's important is fulfillment. So to me, I mean, and it is a kind of happiness, but I'm not sure that the word does that outcome justice. I think fulfillment is the better term. And so for me, when I feel like I am giving and doing good, I am fulfilled. And that is, for me, how I define happiness. But I think of happiness as kind of this really limited term. And I feel like when we talk about happiness, we're not really talking about what makes us feel good.
And that's interesting. Yeah, okay.
Like, I mean, think about it, right? What makes you feel good? Do you feel really, like, don't you feel really good when you phone, you visit somebody in the hospital and they say, thank you for coming. I've been so lonely. I mean, it's not really happiness. You feel good because you did something good for them. So for me, giving, helping, that is fulfillment. And I feel like happiness is way too small a word. Having said that, though, politics is actually most of the time you're not feeling very happy. Yeah. Because it's so hard. Like, it's hard. Everybody's saying terrible things about you. You have not as much time for all the people that you love. And that itself takes a mental health toll for sure.
And how did that manifest itself for you personally?
Well, I mean, I kind of break my political life into 3 different segments. The first one is the one from 2011. So February 2011, I became the leader, and then in March, the premier. And in May 2013, I was elected by the general public. In that first period, I had Gordon Campbell's old caucus, who were completely at war with each other. And none of them save one, who was, arguably one of the less popular members of caucus, none of them supported me. So I come into this caucus, and literally everybody I didn't put into cabinet, not everybody, but most of them, was spending all of their time trying to get rid of me for 2 years. So that was really hard. Like, that was an exercise in, I remember I would say to myself, okay, at one point I realized, okay, the election's going to come in 2013. All I have to do is get to the day the writ is dropped alive, politically alive. Mm-hmm. And then I can carry the whole damn thing on my shoulders. I won't need any of these people who are trying to get rid of me right now, who've been shooting at me in public and leaking from caucus meetings, all that kind of stuff that happens, right? So I just took it as every day I would get up and as a woman, I would, spend a little bit of time, put my makeup, doing my hair, all that stuff that women have to do. And I would spend that time saying to myself, one foot in front of the other. I am not going to get to election day if I don't keep moving forward. And that was what kept me going every day for that first period. And it was super, super hard, because it was like people were chirping my kid, people, other hockey players, like, 8-year-old, 9-year-old kids were chirping. It's funny when I look back on it now, but it wasn't the time. Huh?
Just random kids on the street, or
Well,
like
well, yeah, some of them. I mean, people, it would be mostly people who knew of him.
Yeah.
So some of them would be kids at school. Some of them would be at the hockey rink. He was a goalie also, right? So every time he let in a goal, it'd be like, "You stupid mother." I mean, I can laugh about it now. In fact, I think it made him a much stronger person in lots of ways. But it was so hard. And the worst thing is walking around through your life and having people feel sorry for you because they think you're such a loser. And so, and I think people who struggle with mental illness, I mean, I've struggled with depression. I know what that feels like. I mean, aside from the politics, I know what it feels like to get out of bed and just think, God, I'm such a loser. And then you think everybody else thinks that. But what this really, people were thinking it.
People were actually writing columns about it, and maybe not saying like those exact words or something, but something like it, right?
Well, they were saying those words. They were saying those words. I remember one of the guys in caucus got up and we were we were really in bad shape. Like, this was kind of February before the election. We were 20 points behind, 25 points behind, whatever it was. And one of our cabinet members got up and said, "We are about to hit the buzzsaw of an electoral defeat. And you're all just sitting here and I mean, he really just stood up in the room and insulted everybody, called them all losers. But of course, I was the worst of the losers. He didn't stick around, thankfully, because I'm not sure it would have been helpful in the election to have him on board. But it was really, and the thing that taught me was, I used to say to my son all the time, "Hey, look, Hamish, don't worry about it. When people are saying things to you, they're really just talking about, they're talking about what's going on inside them. You can't really take that stuff seriously." And so I really ended up having to take that on board myself. The hardest was all the people who liked me, who would say, "Christy, I'm so sorry. I know you're having a terrible time."
Yeah. So were those because one of the questions I was going to ask you about was, where, like, in those examples, do you get support from your caucus members? Like,
yes.
Because I was thinking about, and we were talking about it previously. One of the things that I think about a lot, just based on my experience working in politics here in Saskatchewan, is how were you able to support your caucus members when they were having tough times, and were they able to support you? And I mean, it sounds like in the early period in 2011 to 2013, before before the election in 2013, it was a tough time, but because caucuses are like families in a lot of ways, right? You hear this all the time. And here in Saskatchewan, we had two Sask Party MLAs die in office.
Oh.
And I know that was an extremely tough time for everybody, but I have no idea if they talked to each other, or supported each other. So what was that like in your experience?
They were so generous, so great. And, sometimes they would go through very, very tough times too. But again, going back to my earlier point, I got a lot out of feeling like I was supporting them. People who would be in my office crying, or, because they'd gotten a really rough ride, people who were being recalled, I got a lot from the strength of those relationships, the resiliency of it. And so whether or not I was having a tough time or they were having a tough time, I think the process of supporting one another, whichever end of it you're on, when, both ends of it gives you strength. It really did for me. It gave me, I really loved my caucus colleagues and my cabinet colleagues. And they were really, it's just hard to describe, but they were, because it's not a relationship like any other, right? Because you're the boss of them,
Yeah.
but you're also their number one supporter. You're the only people who really understand what you're all going through. So it's really hard to find a comparative for that. But I felt very affirmed by all of them. Now, at the same time, half of them were trying to get rid of me, right? So
Yeah.
it wasn't true of everybody, but the half that were there for me were so totally there. And, the ones that ran in the election, who came back to run in the election, that was real giving, I thought, for our party too, like for our party members and their belief in our province, because they knew they had the best chance to win of anybody that could in their ridings. But many of them just thought it was an impossible task, and they did it anyway. That's saying something.
I found a tweet that you put up on a Bell Let's Talk day. I think it was in 2017, where you shared that your dad had depression. Now it was something that he suffered from, and he was a political candidate as well, like a few times in his life, right?
He ran in 3 elections for the BC Liberals when it was, when there were basically no BC, well, there were a few BC Liberals at some points there, but he ran in 65, 69 in a by-election, and 74 or 72, 74, I think. Never won. He was a teacher. He was the president of the riding association, so it was his job to step up in a riding when no one else would run.
Right. So but in terms of the family history, because you said that you have dealt with depression as well. Was your dad's depression something that you were, I guess, aware of, even like when you were growing up? And
No.
Yeah.
I wouldn't, it's only in retrospect that we all kind of saw it.
Yeah.
And other family members have been diagnosed with depression. My dad was never diagnosed with depression, but he was an alcoholic. That he was treating it with alcohol, and he died when he was 67 of a heart attack, because he wasn't, he had gout and heart problems and all those other things that go along with the sedentary lifestyle of an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And he didn't lead a happy life for probably the last half of it, I would say. He was a jolly extrovert. People really loved him. He was a teacher. He got so much fulfillment from his job. But, once he retired from teaching, his life just sort of seeped away, because he had, again, he had no fulfillment left in it. And so other members of my family I haven't been diagnosed with depression, but I do know what it is like to lie in bed and feel like you don't want to get out of bed, and you're lying there and you're thinking, nobody would notice if I was gone. Nobody would notice if I wasn't here anymore. That fog that you feel walking through your day like a zombie. So I know that that's what it is. But I don't have a professional diagnosis.
Yeah.
So Christy, talking about politics, and really want to get your thoughts kind of more broadly on where we've been and where we're at and where we're going. So you started out in politics at a pretty young age. You worked as a staffer at the BC legislature on Parliament Hill. You first got elected at, I think, 30. From the perspective of stress, pressure, mental health, the kinds of things we're talking about today, how have you seen politics change over that period? Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? A bit of both? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Worse. No question, It's gotten worse. And, it got worse. I mean, it's gotten more partisan and more polarized. And, in British Columbia, I think we've got it worse than any other province in the country, and have had for a long time. And, I think researchers would say, well, BC's always been a super polarized province. That's true. Labor management, rifts, and all those kinds of things. That's all part of our history. But, our party, when Glenn Clark became the premier after 1996, and that was when I joined the caucus, there was a very deliberate attempt, work on our side of the house and the BC Liberal side of the house, to say, we aren't going to deal with those guys. there was all of the social connections between the two sides were cut off. MLAs were highly discouraged from talking to people from on other sides of the house. And that was where it started. And then, then the NDP changed hands and the BC Liberals got into government, and it got worse again. It got even more partisan. And then again, under when Carol James became the leader, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And I think that's what makes it so hard to recruit people into politics. I know social media is a big part of it for sure, and the media in general. But I do think that there's no love there anymore,
So that's a really good segue into the next question I want to ask, which is, as well as anybody, politics is always going to be to some extent inherently combative, right? And that's to some extent a good thing. You got to have vibrant sort of disagreement and different ideas. So that's the point. And the work that's done in governments and legislators is really important, right? The stakes are incredibly high, and there's always going to be issues that just can't wait, right? I know from my own experience, the Premier or the Minister of Health needs this answer in question period in 20 minutes. No, you can't take a coffee break. Go get the answer, right? So how do you think these institutions can become more conducive to the mental health of the people that work in them, both elected and staff, under those conditions, right? You're not going to lose the oppositional mentality or dynamic. You don't want to lose that to some extent. You have certain things that just need to get done in certain time frames. With those things taken for granted, how do you get to a better place when it comes to taking care of the people that are doing these jobs every day?
Well, in politics, there has been a real shortage of people who care or are knowledgeable about human resources.
Yeah.
It's really the kind of the last workplace where that's the case. Even a small startup is going to have somebody who cares and understands human resources, like someone to whom staff people can go and talk about the issues they're facing and try and find some resolution around it. Whether that's working at the next desk to somebody who's, obnoxious, or having a politician who might be sexually harassing them. There's a range of stuff, that happens. It's all unacceptable. And I do feel like I have never worked in a political environment, including one that I created, where we did enough on the human resources side. And, I think in our case, we were very careful about budget and making sure we didn't have too many people in the Premier's office. And one of the jobs that didn't really get fully fulfilled, there were people with responsibility for it, but it never became a full-time job for anybody, was human resources. And I think that that's true for all political parties in the country. It's just not a priority. It's kind of like political people are somehow disposable, and you got to prove how tough you are, and everybody's trying to out-tough each other. And I do think, again, that is partly also the product of the partisanship, right? It's this intense hatred that people are supposed to develop for one another. It's one of the things I love about Biden. Only a guy who's from 40 years ago would remember a time when people could actually get along with each other from other parties, and there's nobody from 40 years ago left in BC politics.
Part of it, I think, as well, is just the built-in 4-year cycle of elections, where how can staff and legislatures plan further than 4 years, 4 years down the road? Politics is very much like what Emile said, it's in 20 minutes, the Premier or my minister needs an answer for question period.
Yeah.
And so why would we plan to get human resources support here when we just need to worry about getting to the end of the week or the end of the day if there's a crisis going on?
The government's failure with the pandemic, both nationally and provincially, across in provinces across the country, and certainly at the federal government, has been in large part because of exactly that. We had the SARS report come out in 2004, which laid the groundwork. It literally sets out the entire plan for how to deal with the pandemic. Nobody paid any attention to it because what is that? That's long-term planning. Yeah. People don't, it's not part of the political cycle. And, even just you look at the difference between Canada's ability to vaccinate versus, say, Britain. Britain started doing that work in May, figuring out how they were going to, which vaccines they were going to buy, how they were going to move it across the country, how they were going to make sure there were enough. One of the reasons they are so far ahead of everybody else, except for Israel and UAE, is because they planned ahead. Go figure. In times of crisis, you really realize how important that is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. And sort of related to that, I think, Christy, certainly you and I, but probably Dale as well, based on people we know in common, we know that politics tends to attract certain personality types, right? Or people with particular traits. And, many of them are my dear friends. Most of my friends are people that I've worked with in politics. But I think I can say, and speaking for myself as well, there's a disproportionate number, I think, of people with insecurities, right, that are looking to fill some kind of a hole in themselves that go into politics. People with workaholic tendencies. I'm sure we can all think of a few people that fit that description, including maybe ourselves when we were in politics. And people who are, because of that, are prone to be hard on themselves, right? So I'm just wondering, one, do you sort of agree that there are those personality types that are drawn to politics? And in that context, where these are people who are going to be hard on themselves, who are going to work themselves to the bone, who are going to, in some cases, neglect their families out of a sense of duty to their boss or to their party, what do those people need in terms of support systems so they can be healthy and do good work and attract more good people into politics that maybe is a bit different than people in sort of the corporate setting or the startup world or other areas where maybe the practices and policies around this stuff are better developed, as you said?
I wouldn't assume that working at a startup is necessarily a whole lot more comfort for people. I mean, I think, people I know who've started companies, it's go, 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 right? It's nonstop and failure is not an option and all that stuff, right? So, but I think in politics, one of the things people don't get is affirmation. They get a lot of negative feedback when they fail, but when they succeed, that's just kind of expected.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a real shortage of that in politics. And I think that could make such a huge difference for people. And I am just a huge believer in families being a part of the process, spouses being part of it, and kids and grandkids being part of it. I mean, I had my son at the legislature, with me when he was an infant for 4 years. And everybody loved having, he got passed around from person to person to person. Everybody loved to be racing down the halls. People still talk to me about that. And I just think we have to make space for families, and we have to offer affirmation and thanks to people that are breaking their backs for all of this. Like, it's not just an idea people are fighting for. I think, when you say people want to go into politics because they're maybe trying to find something, I think what they're trying to find is fellowship and family. They're trying to find people who are as smart as them, who are quick-witted, who can debate issues without fear. All those things are great things, and we need to make space for those things to happen for people.
Yeah.
Christy, is part of you say that it's thankless, right? Or that there's not much affirmation, right? Is part of that problem that people, I was talking with a friend of mine, also a former political staffer, and she said, I think people, as staff, we were regularly told that it's a privilege to be working here. And for politicians, it's the case in the sense that, well, nobody forced you to run, right? You knew what you were getting into.
Yes.
So that means that the public, the media, everybody can, rain the shit down on you as they please, right? But that doesn't sound like a recipe to get the good people to stay in it, because nobody ever says, yeah, that was good work that you did there. And of course people want to be affirmed that their work is good. It's a problem, I think.
I think it is a real problem. And I think, I believe that it's a privilege to work in politics, in as much as I always thought, we are engaged in this incredibly important project of creating jobs for thousands of British Columbians, which we were doing. opening up a brand new LNG industry, getting Site C going, creating, we had basically negative unemployment, huge, much of the province, which to me was a very meaningful contribution to make. And so I think we're all lucky to be a part of it because you're witnessing history. Now, if you're a New Democrat, you might be feeling great about being there because you're doing some other things that make you feel good, right? But if you're a BC Liberal, you're thinking about people's families, people's take-home pay, certainty for the future, all those kinds of things. So I thought that was a privilege for people, just to be all a part of history. You get to be part of this big
Sure.
team. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't feel also happy and fulfilled in your job too. And you certainly shouldn't feel like you're not appreciated.
Right.
It's really hard to build that culture in politics. It really is, because it's kind of a merry-go-round of people that come in and out too, right? Like I remember when I became the premier, I had to sit down with the caucus and with the staff, and I said, okay, here's something that really matters to me, and that's sexual harassment in the workplace. And I want you guys all to know that if anyone sexual harasses another person at work, you're going to be fired, because that is completely unacceptable. And it's kind of a dirty secret of politics that a lot of that stuff has happened and continues to happen. So, but that was kind of for me an example of, if you care about it, you have to make sure that you're following up on it and you're making sure people feel safe. I mean, that's not really affirmation, but it's still important. Make sure people have a safe workplace.
Well, it's affirmation of that person's value, right? Like you deserve to be treated with respect, and
Yes.
and that in itself is something that I think is, to both your points, not reinforced often enough or made clear enough. I made the mistake of saying something creative on Twitter today, which I tend to avoid these days. But I'm not sure when we'll release this, so it may not be relevant by then. But the NDP federally and the federal Conservatives both put out pieces of content on social media that were a little bit on the more creative, outside the box side, and they weren't well received by sort of the mainstream conventional wisdom. But you look at the responses to those tweets, another thing you shouldn't do, and it's like, who did this? Why haven't they been fired yet? Fire the intern who came up with this, right? Over and over and over again. And this isn't exclusive to politics by any stretch, but I do think it's disproportionate, this idea that, as I think you said, Christy, political staff and politicians are often regarded as disposable, right? There's this expectation that because they serve the public, or just because they serve the public, they have fewer rights or are less entitled to a basic level of respect and understanding as human beings than workers in any other field. So I felt the urge to point that out. I'm sure I'll get some pushbacks. I know it's an unpopular opinion that we should care about politicians and political staff and their feelings, but I will stand by it regardless.
Good for you, and Emile, I don't believe it when you say it, that you're going to shy away from unpopular opinions, because that's part of being out of politics. That's part of the joy of it, right? Is being able to talk about these things. Yeah. And, I agree. It's a blood sport. That's why they say it's a blood sport, but it's getting bloodier. And this constant demand that everybody, it's kind of, it's really cancel culture, right? It's just existed in politics for probably longer. We've been demanding resignations for, 30 years, 50 years, whatever. But, I think about, and I think we should worry about that as a society as a whole. I really worry about it on university campuses. And, I think we need to allow people to talk about unpopular ideas if we want to have ideas.
Yeah. Every good idea was unpopular at some point, right?
Yeah.
For the most part.
Yeah. Darwinism, still unpopular with some people.
Yeah, exactly. So, Christy, you often get asked, rightly so, because you made history as the longest serving woman premier in the country. You're often asked about your experience as a woman in a position of leadership and elected leadership. but you also were a staffer, right? And you worked with, a couple generations now of staffers, both men and women. So I'd love to just get your thoughts on the challenges and the barriers that women, and especially young women, face as staff in politics, and also when they're first elected, right? Because I think we can agree being a cabinet minister, being premier, obviously, is a bit of a different experience just because of some of the power and the heft that you have at that point, although it's not without its own challenges. So any thoughts on how women, as distinct from men, and obviously sexual harassment is a big piece of this, but I think not the entire piece. How is it different for young women going into this field for the first time?
I think it's a super intense version of what happens to women in most workplaces when they're at an entry level. And I'm thinking about going into a law firm. I'm thinking about, a woman who goes to work at a trucking company, or a woman who goes whatever. I mean, maybe outside of the civil service, government sort of, teaching and other traditional female jobs. I think it's just way more intense. So all of the things we've already talked about with how punishing it is, how the hours are terrible, how there's no thanks for anything. I think that is harder for women in general. But when you're a young woman, it's really hard to be taken seriously because you're young and you're a woman. I mean, the best thing that ever happened to me is I got older, because seriously, when you're a woman, it's really hard. And so an older woman you're a lot more invisible. People don't see you as a woman in the same way as you get older. So I think the environment, my view is that men are a lot more transactional in their relationships with one another. And so there's kind of an understanding that men have that sits apart from a personal relationship when you're at work. Guys aren't thinking, does he like me? But women are raised from the day we're born to care a lot about, does that person like me? Are we likable? Yeah. And so for women in an environment where there's very little affirmation, where it's super transactional, where there's a lot of competition and polarization, and it's really sometimes angry, I think that is especially hard for women because we grow up in a sexist society where you don't have to care if men are liked. Men don't have to care about that, but women have to care a lot.
We were before you joined us, Christy, we were talking about dress codes in legislatures, and how we've both had experiences in the last couple of years where there were some silly things going on in terms of dress code for women. And it's the most ridiculous things that we've ever heard. Right. So those are.
If you look up my name, or you used to, there was Christy Clark's X or Christy Clark's Y, and it was all about my physical attributes or lack thereof. Those were Twitter feeds. And I'm not alone in that. And the first question I got after I got elected was, who are you dating? The next day at the first press thing I did, I was, Emile, remember this, I was walking into my son's hockey game and the press were all there. We'd invited them. It wasn't, they weren't being inappropriate. The first question I got was, hey, who are you dating? That was so 2 days in a row. It's sort of, and there's a weird obsession with political women's personal lives that does not exist to nearly the same extent for men. Yeah. And, I was talking about someone today who is thinking of seeking the BC Liberal leadership. He has 2 kids. And someone said to me, is that going to be a problem? As in, is he going to be able to look at, as in, is that going to make his life impossible? Genuine caring question. And my response was, oh, no one's going to care because he's a man.
Yeah.
But everybody cared that I had a little guy.
Yeah. So true.
Life.
Some of the people that listen to this podcast will be current elected officials. Some will be future elected officials. We hope. What advice do you want them to hear about, number one, how to treat themselves as they make their way through politics, and secondly, how to treat the staff that work for them, that they work with?
Well, I think most important for themselves is remember, you've got to run your life. Because if you let other people be completely in charge of your schedule, they will eat you alive. I mean, staff members' job is to try and get as much time out of the politician as humanly possible, suck as much time and as much energy. And that's not because they're bad people, it's because they're doing their job. The only person that is going to stand in the way of that is the politician themselves. So you want to have time for your kids, you want to have time for your spouse, you want to have time for your friends, whatever it is, you've got to make sure that you're making that and finding that time. Second, I would say, don't ask for jobs you can't do. At the same time that you're looking after the things you care about. So, for me, I had to jettison a bunch of stuff that I used to love to do. I didn't see I didn't talk to any of my high school friends for almost all that time. All my girlfriends that were in my book club, they were sending me emails half the time I didn't even respond. Like I just jettisoned everything that wasn't my son, my mother, or no, she passed. Well, for once I became premier, she passed away, but in my earlier incarnation, she was around. Or my job. That was basically all I did. It was Hamish job. So I made time for that and I was good with it. But it was, I don't think you can be premier of a province and make time for everybody anymore. So you just have to decide. And then I would say, pay attention to your staff, appreciate them, get to know their families, thank them, and don't read your Twitter feed.
Yeah.
Like seriously, it's the dumbest. One of my colleagues, Kathleen Wynne, said to me one time, "Oh yeah, I get so depressed. Jane helps me out. I'm glad I have Jane there because when I'm reading my Twitter feed, I went, what are you reading your Twitter feed for? Like that's ridiculous. Don't read. Like it's just a big old gang up. It doesn't
You have
represent
staff
anybody.
to do that. You have well-paid staff that are doing that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I guess the last one would be the thing that I said to Hamish. Just remember that when people are angry and acting out, it's usually their problem, not yours.
Christy, choosing to not spend as much time with friends. I'm interested in that. I know that it was a sacrifice that you felt you had to make so that you could do the job the best that you could. Did that take away from you though, like from your, I guess, well-being and not seeing, I'm assuming what are close friends? Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. It was, I'm an extrovert and I love my friends. Like I am surrounded by the best friends. Anybody, like I swear to God, I am so blessed in my friends. They're just amazing people and I miss them. But they made their presence known in my life. Like they would show up to rallies, they'd be cheering, they'd try and sneak their way into TV interviews. They would bring their kids, to let me hug them up. Like they were amazing. And they would see me doing something on TV and they would write me a long note about it. Like they were amazing. So I always felt their presence, even though I missed them. So, and that is that really is the best thing about being out of politics, is getting to spend so much time with my friends now. Like we're doing book clubs on Zoom and walking with a different friend every day. And it's so great. It's so great.
That's awesome. And just picking up super briefly on your point about sort of time management, Christy, and protecting your schedule and carving out the time that you need. One thing I do know, hopefully not giving away any secrets, is that during, I think, both the 2013 and 2017 campaigns, we had an hour booked in your day every day for you to get in some cardio or get in some exercise, which I just highlight because I think that's so important in terms of leadership by example, right? Now that I'm past the sort of immortality and endless energy of my early to mid 20s, I find that hour a day for exercise shapes everything else, right? Like makes me functional in quite a serious way, keeps my depression at bay and manageable. So just wondering if you have anything to add to sort of the importance of that physical activity piece and keeping that well-roundedness when you're under tons of pressure and dealing with huge demands.
Emile, that's been a long journey for me, this journey to exercise. I had a very serious eating disorder in my 30s. and well, very serious. I mean, I don't want to, it was serious to me. And I got very, in fact, when I look back, I looked great, but I was not healthy. My hair was coming out in clumps. My nails wouldn't grow. It was
Wow.
it was just like, it was lots of different physical issues that came from it. And part of that was an exercise disorder. I was over exercising. So I've been kind of back and forth about it. But, by about after 2011, like in 2011, I gained a whole lot of weight. People saw it. And by 2013, I just kind of had come to a place where I'm going to exercise every single day and I'm going to look after myself. And so rather than being constantly worried about how I look and how I appear to people, I'm going to have to decide that I want to try and be healthy. And that was a really difficult journey. And, I still struggle with, I mean, eating disorders are the second most deadly mental illness after opioids on a per capita, on a per affected individual basis. I mean,
Yep.
Obviously depression kills more people, but, in terms of the number of people who have it. And it's something that really never goes away once you've got it. I mean, you're always thinking about it, always thinking about trying to eat less for the rest of your life, and always trying to, exercise more. So this has been a hugely important journey for, I know for you with your depression, and for me in terms of my disordered eating, overcoming that through a healthy amount of exercise and being comfortable with my body image it's been really, really difficult. So
Christy, did that start when you were in politics? Like you said, in your 30s, were you in MLA at that time?
Yes. So I was in MLA, and it started probably around, let me think about this. So I got elected first time in 96. I was quite heavy. And then probably by I probably started about 98, I'm going to say. And then the reason I got over it was because I wanted to have a baby.
Mm.
Can't have a baby and an eating disorder at the same time.
Yeah.
So I ended up taking, serious hormone treatments in order to correct my imbalance and be able to get pregnant. But that was, short of having a need to get pregnant, I don't know when I might have gotten over it. Because, I was getting a lot of affirmation for how good I looked.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But, an eating disorder is a thing where you spend all of your time thinking about what you're going to eat, how you're going to eat it, how long you can delay it, how many calories there are in it. And then after you've eaten it, thinking, how could I have eaten so much? How am I going to go to the gym and work this off? And like your whole brain all day is basically consumed with the math. It's no fun.
And I'm
Yeah.
assuming you went to treatment or therapy to.
I actually didn't.
Really?
I'm not a good example on this. I just got over it. Like it took me a long time to be diagnosed with an eating disorder. Like I didn't really understand what it was, and I didn't recognize it as an eating disorder. Like when you're in it, you just say to yourself, well, that's somebody else has that. I don't have that. So I finally went, it was when I wanted to get pregnant, and I went to a specialist, and they were like, you're going to have to get on hormones because you have an eating disorder, lady. And that was when I sort of found out that I had it. But if you look at pictures of me kind of from the late 90s, before I got pregnant, I was pretty slim. And like I said, a lot of positive reinforcement. And it was actually Kevin Kruger who came up to me from like Emile from Kamloops and said, Christy, I just think you're getting too skinny. Is everything okay?
Wow.
But he was really the only person who noticed, including me.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Well, it's we live in a society where how women look really matters because it's not fair. It's just not fair. And it's so much work to conform. And I think it's getting worse. Instagram and the Kardashians and surgery. And I just think it must be so hard for young women now.
One of the messages we're trying to get across to our listeners is that everybody has an interest in improving the mental health and wellness of politicians and folks in politics and public life. This is not just about those people narrowly. It's about our democracy and the well-being of our whole population and making our democracy better. So as somebody who's worked in and around politics for a long time, at every level from very junior to the absolute top, can you share your perspective on that?
On just, I think politics can be a way better place for people to work. I don't think we can throw people away the way that, there's this, Emile, there is a real shortage of really talented people in politics. It's getting harder and harder and harder choosing to go somewhere else. And that says a lot about the system and how the system is broken. And so I'm really hopeful that we can help fix it. I do think, though, your generation, Emile, how old are you?
31.
31. So you're not a millennial, or you're just about a millennial, I guess, right? But you're from a generation of people that cares about these things. You're not lazy. You're not a snowflake or whatever insulting name people have for younger people. You are, but you care. And I think a caring, inclusive workplace is something that an obligation that every employer needs to take more seriously now. And I just don't think politics can say it's an exception. And I think we're going to have to decide that we're willing to invest in political people, that it might cost a little bit more money, but we're willing to invest in staff and in staff's well-being and good health. And, I think when and I think we should maybe think about asking politicians how they treat the people that work for them, Maybe we should ask them that sometimes. A little less selfishness, a little bit more selflessness, right?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Dale, what I miss?
No, that last topic, and Christy, that answer that you gave, it's something that I look back on a lot. And of course, I know people that still work at the legislative building, and I think often about what can be changed to help not just the political people that I know and support, but just the workplace itself. And we were talking about the political workplace yesterday, and I mean, you're right. Some serious work needs to be done there, and it needs a total system revamp.
Bill Bennett, when he was the premier, gave MLAs free ferry passes. I mean, that was, and it became very controversial. And Gordon, once Gordon was the premier, I think in the 2000s or whatever, and it all got canceled. Everybody was all upset about MLAs getting. But the reason he did it, Bill Bennett did it, was because he wanted to give MLAs a chance to go home to see their families more often, because he recognized that the rate of marriage breakdown and family discord was massive. So unless we're going to have all MLAs from Victoria and the entire province is going to be represented from, Langford to Cowichan Valley, we're going to have to make sure that we find ways to support spouses and children continuing to be connected. And, politicians shouldn't be just talking to each other anyway. They should be spending a little bit of time at home and talking to people who aren't in politics.
Yeah.
Pretty good grounding.
Yeah, you're right.
So true.
Great.
Christy, can't thank you enough for your time. You've been super generous and super open, and it's gonna make a tremendous impact. I really can't thank you enough.
You know what I get to do right now? Something I would never have been able to do before. My friend is having a tough time, and her dad's in politics, her dad's in the hospital, and her mom's got her. I'm gonna go pick up her kids from school.
Amazing.
For the rest of the week. So that's
something you wouldn't have been able to do when you were premier.
Exactly. Exactly.
Nice.
Well, love it. Great. That is awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I hope we didn't make you late to do that, because that's important. Huh? I hope we didn't make you late for that, because that's important.
You don't know this, Emile, because you don't have kids, but school still ends at 3:00.
Oh yeah.
Good to know. Mm-hmm. Good to know.
Okay. Good talking to you, Christy. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah, I
Emile.
really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Dale. It was great.
Okay. Take care.
Stay well.
Have a good one.